Hey everyone, my name is Jasper and I produce melodic EDM under the name Amadeux, and today I'm going to show you how I recreated a track by Trivecta and Nurko called You Could Be My Light using only Ableton stock instruments. So if you use Ableton, you may know that a large variety of instruments come with Ableton in the stock library, and by and large they sound pretty shitty, so I'm just going to click through a few of them, give you a little taste of what we're dealing with here. So not exactly the kind of thing that we'd should typically think of being useful to build tracks out of. But I took up as a challenge, recreating this track by Trivecta and Nurko out of them, and I thought it might be fun to show you all a little bit of how I did it. So thanks, and I hope you enjoy. So here we are in Ableton, and the first thing that I think should be noted is the first half of the track is a little bit more built around splice vocals than a direct recreation of the Trivecta and Nurko track, whereas the drop is a little bit more of a direct recreation of the drop from the Trivecta and Nurko track. So the first thing that we have is, I wanted to point out a synth guitar that I found in the Ableton library. With a little bit of processing, I think it becomes a lot more usable. So it sounds like this. And we have an arpeggiator, basically making it arpeggiate the chords on eighth notes, and then compressing it to kind of even out the sound a little bit. Guitar amp and filtering Saturn for saturation, like awesome saturation plugin that I really like. And then Valhalla Room, and finally some Haas effect stereoization. And that kind of provides a little bit of a good kind of foundation for the melodic verse. So it sounds like this in total. Melody in my head that I cannot forget. You're the only. And then on the second half of the verse, we have a synth E-bass coming in that's also part of the Ableton stock library. It sounds like this. That kind of just adds a little bit of an extra thing to come in on the second half of the verse. It sounds like this. And then you'll also note, if you know the original track, that I have this Synth Marimba. It's just basically an operator sine wave that's been processed in a variety of ways. And that's actually playing a melody directly from the Trivecta and Nurko track. I thought it was a little kind of a fun Easter egg, I guess, and a little bit of a counter melody to the Splice sample that I'm using for the vocals. So it sounds like this. And some of the processing that's being done here is I have a Valhalla Room reverb immediately after the operator instrument. And then I'm actually compressing the crap out of that, and then I have the Moog Airband EQ. That one of my favorite EQs, really good for adding top end in a really nice way, and then a little bit more Haas effect stereoization. And it should be noted that while I am using only stock instruments, I did decide that it'd be fun to use non-stock effects, just because a little bit more different than what some other people have done when they're dealing with doing stock recreations of tracks and that such. So yeah, you'll note that I think the main ones that I'm really using are Valhalla Room, this Moog Airband EQ, and FabFilter Saturn for saturation. But everything else is pretty stock in general. But just thought it'd be kind of a fun divergence to do that. And then a little bit of a rhythm on the first verse is being provided by this, it's a conga sample from the Ableton stock library, and without any processing it sounds like this. Kind of boring and shitty. But what I'm doing is I have a vocoder, just stock vocoder on noise mode, just kind of spacing out a little bit, and then actually comb filtering with serum effects to kind of give it a little bit of a metallic sound that makes it sound a little bit more cymbally, I guess. And then I'm gradually automating up the resonance and drive on the comb filter, actually, which kind of gives an effect of somebody playing hi-hat and then gradually opening up, which kind of builds tension a little bit. So initially sounds like this, and then by the time it opens up on the chorus, it sounds like this. And then after that, just saturating, compressing, auto pan to give a little bit of feel, reverb, EQing, and house effect again. So that's a little bit of a fun thing. On the verse, I also have this drum set, Wicked Chillin', which is also a stock drum set. Sounds like this. Pretty straightforward. I don't think I modified anything on here, and then just some stock effects. So that's the verse. Let's see. The chorus sounds like this. So one fun thing that I'm doing on the chorus is I found this vocal sample somewhere in the Ableton stock library. Doesn't sound great, but I actually loaded it into Granulator, which is the Ableton, it's an AMXD device that is basically just a granular synth, and threw it in there and processed a little bit and played kind of a melody that comes in on the second half of the chorus. Sounds like this. A little bit of a fun thing that kind of provides a little bit of heaven's opening moment on the second half of the chorus. Kind of adds a little bit of tension on the build-up as well. And so now we get to the drop, which sounds like this. So the first thing that one might have a problem with when creating a future bass drop with Ableton stock instruments is the fact that there's not really any good super saw sound in the Ableton stock library. There's actually not anything that has that basic of a waveform. It's all kind of processed in weird ways. So I actually didn't basically recreate that from scratch. And how I did that was this. I took a, let's see, where is it? Here we go. I took basically any stock sound will do, but I just took a relatively processed sawtoothy kind of sound from the stock library and actually filtered out everything but the fundamental frequencies. So after 4 EQ8s taking out everything but the fundamental, we're left with basically just a sine wave. And then what you could do after that is various types of distortion will then add back more frequencies on top of that. If you were doing like a hard clipping distortion, you would get something pretty close to a square wave. I found that the Ableton stock amp in boost mode produced something pretty similar to a sawtooth, ends up sounding like this when you do all of that. That's pretty useful for getting that kind of sawtooth sound out of what is, technically speaking, a Ableton stock library instrument. And then threw that into, again, the granular synthesis that comes free with Ableton, and processed a little bit with a little bit of reverb, mid-side OTT, and EQ, and sounds like this. That provides kind of a nice little foundation for the drop. And then after that, I just stacked a variety of other supersaw-esque things that came in the Ableton stock library over that, stuff like that. So all of those sound relatively shitty, but when you kind of throw them all together, stick some white noise on top, then you kind of get a result that sounds decent. That's kind of a general, when you're building this kind of wall of sound drops, usually doesn't hurt to add in some more stuff. And then actually the basses are didn't need to do anything fancy to come up with the basses for this. They're all just stock basses that don't sound great, but they're by all means usable for this genre. Sounds like this. And then it turns out that there's a sine wave type sub bass direct in the stock library, so that was pretty easy. And then what I'm actually doing is I'm using Kick Tight, which is a preset in Corpus to kind of blend things together. Got this trick from AU5, and when you route the MIDI from one of the basses in, it kind of has the effect of tying everything together in the low end, as well as reducing the actual amount of volume things are taking relative to perceived loudness. So not exactly sure why it works, but it's just something that I have tended to do on bass stacks that works really well in this genre. And I mentioned that I'm using Splice Samples for the vocals. I'm also using Splice Samples and various percussion loops for the drums on the drop, mostly because it would be pretty difficult to recreate a decent sounding drum set from Ableton stock stuff. But I don't really consider that to be like a thing that's not recreatable by most people, because you can just find loops off of Splice or whatever. So, and then one thing I did on the drop was I had some vocal chops that I got basically just from chopping up the vocal samples. Sounds like this. So what I'm doing here is typically one often wants to turn down the formants on these because I did transpose it up an octave, but then in order for it to not sound like Alvin Chipmunks, you do want to turn down the formants. So I often would use something like Melodyne for that, but this time I'm actually using the stock vocoder in formant -5, which is a preset. Filtering out the top end, reverb before some more processing, which kind of accentuates the reverb a little bit when you're OTTing, and then saturating after that. Mid-side OTT, which in this case is really awesome for stereoizing in a transparent way, as well as kind of making the kind of a small sounding vocal sample sound full spectrum. Saturating again, taking out some of the low end so it's not muddy, and then echoes. And then I'm actually transposing changing up the transposition within the vocal, within the audio file to kind of match the harmonies. And then the last thing that I think is actually most important to recreating this track is you'll note that there's kind of a unique rhythm on the kind of entire bus of the drop. Sounds like this. And that was actually one of the hardest things to recreate for me, because it's not just a basic waveform in LFO Tool or AutoPan or anything like that. So what I did to get this was actually in LFO Tool, the key to getting this rhythm is actually kind of recreating an ADSR envelope of sorts, so that it actually sounds kind of like a synth, or sounds a little bit more natural than just like, I don't know, a triangle waveform in LFO Tool or something like that. Then a little bit of like PWM to kind of get the rhythm right, smoothing, and at 66% wet. And then I'm automating up and down the rate on this, so that you get kind of a little bit of an interesting rhythm, as opposed to just something that sounds static and boring, which is kind of, I guess, what some feature-based people end up doing. And that kind of gives it kind of a interesting rhythmic feel that kind of keeps things moving forward. And in my opinion, that's one of the aspects of the original Trivecta and Nurko track that is really compelling, that I like a lot. So that's all for this breakdown. If you enjoyed the kind of music I make, please do check out my SoundCloud page or YouTube channel. For instance, I recently released a remix of a track called Live in the Now by Outwild, formerly Anakshut, which came out on Ophelia Records in June. So please do check that out, and thanks for watching.
You're the melody.